This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Isop. Today we are talking about different ways to scale. As innovators in civil society, we are rightly concerned with scaling our interventions so that we can reach more people and expand the effectiveness of our interventions. But today, I want to ask the question, is bigger always better? To avoid a purely academic or abstract conversation about scale, today we have a specific real-world challenge in mind: the food system. We all need nutritious food to live healthy lives, so it stands to reason that the topic of scale and food are inextricably linked. But the global network of diverse businesses, growers and suppliers has scaled in such a way that it's had negative consequences for people and the environment. More than a third of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to the way we produce, process, and package foods. This is a topic that my guest, Scott Remy, has spent a large chunk of his professional life thinking about. Scott has directed the Southern African Food Lab since 2013. This is a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together actors in the regional food system to identify and pilot innovative means to achieve sustainable food security. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I want to begin today's conversation by veering into abstract concepts just for a little while before we talk about concrete examples. What are we talking about when we talk about scale?
I appreciate very much your point that the idea of scale can be fairly abstract, and the importance of really grounding it into practicality. I think that's been the emphasis of the Food Lab. We, of course, take inspiration from literature, from academic pieces, but really it's the learning that we've undertaken on the ground, particularly in eThekwini, where the notion of scale has become embedded in essentially our day-to-day work. It informs most of our strategies. So the scaling out concept, I think, is well known. It's the idea of impacting a greater number of, say, individuals or beneficiaries. We often do that through replication of something that we deem successful, or it may mean that we take lessons and we disseminate it elsewhere. So that's like scaling out. It's the numbers are increased over time. Another way of thinking about scale, which I think is also relatively well known, is that of scaling up. So you're taking a process that may be embedded in the grassroots, it's eliciting or facilitating positive change, and we try and bring the essence, the lessons of that, and impact laws and policy. So we're taking it up to the scale of legislation, for example, or frameworks that can then inform other processes, other interventions. And so that would be scaling up. Scaling out, scaling up, to, I think, clear ways to think about it. The third topology which we work with, which is probably the most difficult, is what we call scaling deep. And that's where we try and shift the connections between people, relationships, communities, and culture at the level of cultural underpinnings. So in other words, how do you get things to be so embedded, so ingrained, that in itself it influences other generations? It is able to ensure that the shift happens, that a cultural norm begins to shift in a way that something has changed.
I think we're off to a good start. You summarized what it means to scale out, to scale up, and to scale deep. Now, for civil society organizations that are concerned with scaling, irrespective of the type of scale, what should they be thinking about in terms of the questions that they need to ask themselves, such as why are we scaling in the first place and who decides what type of scale is needed? How do they go about thinking about what scale is right for their organization?
Again, a challenging question. For me, it's about legacy. So often our projects or our interventions are bound in terms of resources, so people, finances, staff. Often they're bound in terms of time. There's a time period. Very often we don't have the luxury of second or third phases in terms of our work. And the legacy issue can inform how the scaling agenda then emerges. So if we're trying to create something that works effectively in a place and bound, how do we scale it out? How do we reach a greater number of people? Do we then connect with other partners? Do we have a deliberate process of building, for example, a network where that replication can take place? Our legacy then impacting greater numbers. Scaling up, well, we've done something that's effective or we believe is effective. Do we want to change legislation? Do we feel that here is something that if it's embedded in the legal framework, the policy framework, that it could have a much greater reach? And then I think it would be about our legacy, about informing policy change. The scaling deep is, I think, really about the difficult changes within, and that's within the particular place that we're working with, within the particular people, within ourselves in terms of that change. And again, thinking about that legacy. Do we want to pursue this particular project in a way that changes our own organization fundamentally? That could be a question. Is it a way that we can generate a true commitment to participation, to inclusion, to the rights of people that we're working with? So I really think it comes down to the organization's goal, but also the principles, almost the ideology that underpins the organization, and then thinking through what is the legacy I want to leave or we want to leave with this particular intervention.
I think that's a useful way to start thinking about it. I'm going to stick with the theme of asking difficult questions. When you take a project or intervention that was successful in one setting, say for example it was successful in an urban or peri-urban setting, and you attempt to replicate it in a different setting, let's say a rural setting, things don't always work out for various reasons. What should organizations do next?
So absolutely, the different contexts, different methodologies, different processes, and I think it's about working away from cookie cutters approach. So we're not trying to replicate something that worked in one particular place, even if it's another urban example. What is it in the intervention in terms of principles, process, ways of working that we can emulate and take elsewhere? And I think that would be a better way of then finding it rooted in very different contexts. So rather than looking at a sort of end goal, here what we're looking at is the processes in order to achieve something in terms of those principles. And we work within those principles or the essence of it. I think that would be my immediate response to that question.
That's a sage response, Scott, but I do have a quick follow-up. How can civil society organizations communicate this to their donors or funders?
It is incredibly difficult to convey messages of, we wish to pursue a process. That process has undefined outcomes. We want to dance with the situation as opposed to direct it. And in many ways, it's about establishing, first of all, relationships with donors that are open to that, but also for donors themselves, I think, to be circumspect, really circumspect, about what it is that they've achieved with their investments or their support. And I think if that conversation happens, it would be easier to convey the message of, let's follow process, let's be real about the challenges that we're engaged with, and let's not be so locked in to these hard objectives and goals that in fact what happens in the end is in fact a superficial change which could very readily go back to the status quo soon afterwards.
I do like that phrasing, let's dance with the situation instead of directing it. Now that we've spoken about various ways to think about scale, let's talk about how you are approaching the topic through sustainable food systems, considering your involvement in the Wozanami project in KwaZulu-Natal, which is focused on agroecology. Let's start by answering the question, what is agroecology?
Earlier on, you depicted or characterized global food systems and the challenges of, and what I took from it, large, powerful organizations that are operating at a scale that in many ways is detrimental to both nature, ecology. You mentioned greenhouse gas emissions and you mentioned climate change. You could pull that into ecological degradation. Food systems are also having a profoundly negative impact on people. We see that in terms of nutrition data. So whether it's in South Africa, Southern Africa, or more globally, the high levels of underweight, of stunting, of micronutrient deficiencies, of overweight and obesity, and how these play out, particularly in health issues. The food system is connected with so many other systems, and without really engaging with it from both that ecological and social aspects, those negative change will continue, and they continue at scale, just to use that term. Agroecology counters that. It essentially looks at, in the first instance, a way of growing, of farming that works with nature. So ecology is the study of the relationship between plants, animals, and people. I think we're aware of that, and how they interact within their environment. And within ecological systems, where there is little interference, or where there is a balance, those things are in sync. There are not very many inputs that are coming in from elsewhere, and that balance allows then the healthiness of that system. Agroecology brings back those principles in a very central way, and is very cautious and very critical of, for example, conventional agriculture, where we've got heavy inputs, often chemicals, often different types of seeds. Not necessarily the challenge of those things as they interact with nature, of course that's important, but it's about the control of those systems. As we know, GMOs, seed systems, fertilizer, agri-chemicals, these things are controlled by large corporations. And our food system, our agricultural system, is at the behest of those power dynamics. Agroecology takes that power back, places it in a particular place, finds the harmony or the synchronicity between people and nature, and allows in a farming system to evolve that has things such as connectivity, has things such as diversity, both of biology but also of society, has things such as fairness, connectivity, participation, inclusion. So it's both a practice and it is a set of principles that are then embedded. So agroecology, not easy to define, but I think just in terms of the way I've characterized it to give you some elements of its essence.
How does Wozanami approach this topic of scale?
So Wozanami has at its essence agroecological transitions. It is focused very much on eThekwini, which is a large metropolitan area on the east coast of South Africa. The Durban municipality is part of eThekwini. Our approach has been from the first instance that we were working hand in glove with local officials, with a local government that is in some ways intentional in looking towards alternative food systems. eThekwini has a number of agroecological hubs with varying degrees of impact and effect, and we've worked with them to focus on one in particular, in Inchanga, which is on the outer west of the metro. So it's an area that is characterized as peri-urban, maybe even peri-rural, underpinned by obviously ward councillors that are elected, but also a number of traditional authorities or traditional leaders that have been in that area for literally decades. Wozanami focuses on the Inchanga hub. It works to scale the impact in ways that reach far more farmers that the hub is engaged with, so cooperative farmers, but also one home, one farm gardens. It also works to scale it up in terms of that. With what has emerged there, we are trying to impact not only the food policy of eThekwini, but hopefully through that to inspire also other cities and in time, possibly even national policy. And it's about leaving legacy. So it's also about scaling deep in that particular place. So that happens both with the farmers themselves, but also with those officials and how they're interacting with essentially different community members in that place.
Scott, let's talk a bit more about how Wozanami is scaling deep. As you mentioned, it's a multi-sector partnership formed to strengthen healthy food production, nutrition awareness, and fresh food access. And in order to scale deep, you need to embed certain practices, certain values, and certain ways of doing things within not only the community, but the various actors involved in the agroecology process. How is Wozanami doing that?
The scaling deep has been informed by the intense relationship with both the farmers and the local officials. So in partnership with the Participatory Guarantee System South Africa, which is an organization that tries to promote agroecology through the creation of different groups that assure an area that the production, the growing, is truly embedded in agroecological principles and practice, but also that the food itself is guaranteed in terms of being organic, for example. We partnered with PGS so that all of the farmers involved in the Nchanga Hub could follow a training process of essentially a wide range of agroecological practices. So literally from worm farming, soil protection, the development of composting, the ways of laying out fields, intercropping, these types of practices, to principles of, for example, connectivity, of finding opportunities of creation of different entrepreneurial opportunities. One person is creating a composting system that is then feeding into the growers. The growers themselves are connected to local traders that are then provisioning the local community. So we're looking at circularity. The PGS partnership allowed that training to unfold over a period of time. It wasn't only focused on the farmers, but also on the officials so that they were able to emulate that in time. The curriculum that was developed in terms of that training is also a legacy project, so it remains within Nchanga so that the scaling out, for example, can be replicated. The scaling deep is that when we change the practice, because the values and beliefs of those farmers and those officials have changed, that it then becomes truly sustainable. And so our focus has been very much around pollination of PGS, of those principles and those practices around and within Nchanga. That's one example of how we've scaled deep in that particular place.
A reminder of what PGS stands for, its Participatory Guarantee System. Thanks for that, Scott. I want to understand how you are thinking about replicating Wozanami. You mentioned that Wozanami is scaling out. How is that being done?
So we are fortunate to be going into a second phase, and we are in fact thinking about all three dimensions of scaling. So in terms of the scaling out, it's about increasing the number of cooperatives that we'll be engaging with through Nchanga. So that will be essentially a replication of the training of that work with a larger number of farmers, both the cooperatives and the one home, one farmer gardeners. So that's the one aspect of it. Another way of scaling it out is that I mentioned earlier that eThekwini has a number of hubs, and all of them work in different ways. The successes, and we believe they are successes of Nchanga, are going to be replicated in other hubs, so within the bounds of the metro. So officials, those that are perhaps sitting at a higher management level, will be bringing some of those principles, some of that practice, some of that experience, and taking it elsewhere in the actual metro. The scaling up, as we speak, a food policy is being developed for eThekwini, and we have been fortunate to be invited to be part of the team that is developing that particular framework, that rule of the game, shall we call it, in a inclusionary participatory process. And so the principles of our work are going to be essentially, shall we say, lodged within that policy. We're going to engage with the metro. There is some tension, as you can imagine, because there are different ways of thinking about agriculture and food. But the argument is that Wozanami has had relative success. Let's bring that centrally into the policy and then try and scale it up in that way. The scaling deep is our continuous interaction with those officials and those farmers in a ways that change the lived experience in terms of people interacting with that food system.
Thanks, Scott. The 3 dimensions of scaling that we've spoken about are the activities, but the goal is impact. Tell me about Wozonami's impact in this particular community.
So I'm going to be cautious in terms of claiming impact, but I will speak in terms of our review and assessment of the first phase, and talk in terms of learning journeys or learning experiences that we've conducted in Wozonami to try and understand something about what has worked. I think the first thing is that this culture of dialogue, of participatory, inclusionary process has been something that we have established within the hub itself. That, for me, is been absolutely key. When officials, as a routine basis, are using some of those inclusionary, participatory processes in terms of their day-to-day work. The farmers themselves are working in ways that are very different to the ways they were working in the past. So there's a lot more focus on composting, on soil health, on circularity, on ecological health. That, we believe, is a very evident sign of impact, the way that the agronomy, the actual farming, has changed and shifted. Another objective of Wozonami has been to, through markets, provision the local community with opportunities for nutritious, healthy food. Now there I'm going to be a bit more careful because, of course, that market has been supported. Some of the informal traders operating in the area, particularly one that is supporting the local clinic, they are beginning to essentially find some produce from those farmers. They supplement it with, I think, what is called the Durban Fresh Produce Market in Clarewood, where they get most of their fresh produce. But they are increasingly supplementing their trade with those farmers' produce. And I think that is also an impact. I'm not going to go so far that Wozonami then has impacted on what people are choosing, what people are consuming, and in fact on their diet. We don't have the way of claiming that, and I think it would be too far. Although the provisioning through informal traders, through self-consumption, through the fact that more and more of that fresh produce from Wozonami is available in Nchanga, I would argue is moving towards an impact.
We know that experts have varying opinions on the topic of scale. Lately, researchers supported by the International Development Research Center are questioning our inherent assumptions about scaling and are forcing us to think about whether bigger is always better. Their approach, known as scaling science, is understood as a justified and coordinated focus on impact at optimal scale. What are your thoughts about optimal scaling?
Yeah, I think it's an important idea, and it's almost a principle in terms of the way we work with scaling. So for me, it's around taking stock, about reflection, about taking those moments through a process within a project to stand back with those people most affected by the changes that are happening and to really consider what's happening. Have we gone far enough? Should we be consolidating? Is there a concern that perhaps we haven't scaled deeply enough with those that we are working with, and that perhaps that should be the focus, and that we should leave the replication or the scaling up to policy in terms of really leaving a legacy? So adequacy, I think, is about being cautious, about being realistic, about working within the true dimensions of a particular project or a place so that we don't overstep ourselves. So often we can think about scaling and rapidly chase a whole lot of numbers, but in fact it's superficial scaling. Adequacy is to counter that. Another caution about scaling is, for example, around our obsession with policy. So if we want to scale up and change the rules of the game, the policy or the legislative framing, I think we should be very cautious and very circumspect about why we're doing that. We have a country with an extraordinary number of policies, of regulations that have a bearing on the food system. In fact, with a recent review that was undertaken, somebody who's engaged with the African Union commented South Africa could be a role model for the rest of the continent, just in terms of its policy framework around food system and food system change. But the reality is how poor our implementation is. So I would ask, in terms of our focus on scaling up, why are we doing it? Are we really working with questions around implementation first, getting that right, in order to then inform a policy with its accompanying processes that allow it to ultimately have impact? So that would be, I think, another response to that question.
Thanks, Scott. I think this conversation has been useful because we started with an academic perspective and then we grounded it in a practical experience of Wazanami. I want to take it into a space where we can reimagine now. Let's reimagine our global food system. What would be the best way to scale that would be beneficial for us as well as the environment?
All three dimensions in a number of projects that hold at its core principles of social and ecological justice. So I know that sounds abstract and it sounds pie in the sky. Wazanami is working its way out. It's trying to, with officials and farmers, establish something that's new, that is ultimately about the ecology and about local people. It isn't about a local food system. It is rather about an alternative set of flows of food that sustain it over generations, over time. And if we took that example and we took those principles and we were able to scale it in different ways in different places and allow that to emerge, that for me would be the journey towards something which I think is the future that we need in terms of food systems.
I've loved this conversation. I've absolutely loved this conversation. In the socioeconomic development sector, terms like scaling up, out, and deep are commonplace, but depending on who you speak to, you may get a nuanced interpretation of each term. So for those listening to this podcast, I hope that this conversation with Scott today has helped you to think more deeply about what scale looks like for your organization in the different contexts in which you work. Thanks so much, Scott. Now, over to you. Those listening to this podcast, using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website, learninglunch.dgmt.co.za. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Number 1. Start by reflecting on how your organization is currently thinking about scaling. Number 2, what challenges are you currently experiencing in implementing your chosen scaling strategy? And number 3, what type of scaling strategy would help your organization achieve the most impact? It may be all 3. This was DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.